So this is extractivism from 2,000 years ago, built on enormous quantities of human slave labor from all over Europe that is still highly visible. How did they do this with a level of technology, even replacing machines by humans or having humans as their machines? They constructed enormous hydraulic works, or at least the slaves did, not the Romans, in order to slowly pressurize the water from the rivers below and force it to high pressure hose, sluice away all of this alluvial soil, where then they collected the sieve for the gold down in the rivers below. And so an enormous project where all of that wealth then flowed back to Rome, the center of the empire, and still clearly visible today. So in many regards, as much as we are obviously talking about the ways in which extractivism has expanded towards a global scale, it's also not as much of a new phenomenon as one might think. And there was just a recent paper out that, just a couple of weeks ago actually, that illustrated that you could actually pinpoint when the Spanish started extracting gold and silver from the mines in Potosi in Bolivia and elsewhere in Peru by new extraction technologies that they had pioneered. And we can now read this in the geological record, or at least in ice cores, from Peruvian glaciers, which are fast melting. So it's a good job this research was already done. And having just been in Bolivia, a lot of us in, on the left, in the West, and so on, are rightly inspired by a lot of the events that have gone on in Bolivia. And yet when you actually look at what Bolivia is investing in, constrained by the limits, I just recently wrote an article on Bolivia and what's going on there, constrained by the limits of international capital, but nevertheless, when you look at the scale of investment, number 1, 2, and 3, mining, hydrocarbons, electrical energy, and then if you look at the eradication of extreme poverty, way down the list, health, even further down the list. And so in terms of the scale of extraction, actually one of the quotes in the article is from a mining activist there who says during the Morales era, more gold and silver has been extracted than in the whole of the colonial period. And so this is a map actually. The pre-Morales mines are in orange, and the post-Morales mines are in red. So you can see a large expansion of mining in Bolivia as the economic growth has taken off in that country. So this raises all kinds of questions about, well, we talked a little bit yesterday, what does an exit strategy from capitalism really look like? Because if Bolivia is, I think, rightly seen as perhaps the most hopeful country that we can look towards, where the social movements have really put, for the first time in South American history, post-colonial history, an indigenous person in power to represent them. And he rose to power specifically resting on the basis of the social movements. Then it gets to kind of your question about, well, how do we really escape the dynamics of capitalism? What is it that's propelling this system? At the same time, as we know, according to the last report, the impact of emissions, severe, pervasive, and irreversible. Failure to reduce emissions, the group of scientists and other experts found, could threaten society with food shortages, refugee crises, flooding in major cities, entire island nations, mass extinction, lots of other pretty horrendous stuff that people probably know about, but it's not that we don't know about it, right? And I think that this is obviously an important point, an important thing to bear in mind, although we've known about it for a long time. So this is a quote from Rachel Carson, 1953, talking about the ways in which our climate was already changing. Her emphasis and focus at the time was on the oceans, but it's an indication of the way in which everything is connected to everything else, to quote Barry Commoner. And so Now, just to get to capitalism for a second, if we're overfishing, then we're running out of fish. What is the response? The response to capitalism in this reductionist paradigm that it has with regard to science is to apply science to this problem. My background is in science. It's not to go back and say, well, if we're overfishing, how could we put in quotas? How could we establish limits? How could we regenerate the fishing resources? Not at all. It's to invent another technology to get around the first problem that you already created, which is fish farms, right? Which actually means you have to fish more, because what do those fish eat? Other fish. So you're fishing for fish to feed the fish that you're keeping now in the fish farms. If that's not enough, which it seems like it's not, okay, so we haven't got enough fish farms now with all of the negative consequences that entails, people probably know about. What are you going to do now? Are you going to revisit your original problem and maybe come up with some kind of combined, collective, cooperative solution to that? No, you're not if you're a capitalist. What are you going to generate next? Well, if your fish aren't growing fast enough in your fish farms, the next step, obviously, is to genetically modify those fish so that they grow faster and larger. And so that is already obviously being done with the about to be released by the EPA, anyway, the US EPA, the regulations on genetically modified salmon. It's still this paradigm of scientists saying, well, if we just explain the science, right, scientific rationality will trump any economic drive by the system itself. Now, clearly that's not happening. And so some scientists are starting to break with that. So Kevin Trenberth, people at the Hadley Climate Center, Alice Bowes, Michael Mann, who was threatened with a lawsuit by his own university, basically, for talking about climate change, are now speaking out in more radical terms. So this is obviously a good thing. On the other hand, there's a lot of glorification in the United States, which is where I live right now, on how exciting the shale revolution really is, and how if you try and evade it, you'll be left as a subject of history rather than one of the motivating forces, one of the prime movers. Walter Russell Mead is, Council of Foreign Affairs. This magazine is read by the ruling class of the US to get an idea of what they should be up to. And so not an extreme view of any kind. Whereas Michael Ignatieff, writing in 2003, being an imperial power, however, is more than being the most powerful nation or just the most hated one. It means enforcing such order as there is in the world and doing so in the American interest. It means laying down the rules America wants on everything from markets to weapons of mass destruction, while exempting itself from other rules, the Kyoto Protocol on climate change, for example. So it's pretty blatant. He even calls it the burden, although in the article he denies that America is anything to do with carrying any white man's burden. But a major opinion former in the US talking about the ways in which the US could be a new kind of imperial empire. And somebody else who came up with the latest study for the American Academy of Sciences. It's clear the economic system is driving us towards an unsustainable future, and people of my daughter's generation will find it increasingly hard to survive. History has shown that civilizations have risen, stuck to their core values, and then collapsed because they didn't change. That's where we are today. And this is where I think the whole paradigm, Jared Diamond's paradigm about collapse, Easter Island, everything that was talked about a lot yesterday is completely misplaced. Because what was wrong with those that society in particular was not the fact that they were overpopulated or they didn't realize that there was only one tree left. It was actually that the social system that they lived under and the technology limitations that they also existed under, those two things combined to make it impossible for them to find solutions. Although actually, if you read about it, they came up with ingenious solutions, the society, to carry on living in different ways, conserve water, conserve rations, and actually fish at different levels in different ways. But but it was the fact that more and more resources were put towards irrational things, such as statue building. So the largest statues on Easter Island are actually built towards the end, multi-ton statues. So imagine the amount of human resources going to that kind of activity in order to appease the gods, to keep the people in power, and so on. That could have been used and devoted to other things if there'd been some kind of social revolution. And so obviously there were limits to that question in those times from a technological perspective, but we don't have those limits in terms of technology, right? It would be depressing if we didn't know the technological answers, but we know all of those. We know what's possible. It's really just a completely a question of social and political change. So there are restrictions on water use in California, and in order to, so they can't water their lawns, but in order to keep them looking green, they are spray painting them green. So this is a new expanding business, and I think that this illustrates in microcosm the fact that capitalism can turn anything into a commodity, right? The idea of shock doctrine, but you don't really need a shock because they will commodify anything. They've managed to commodify, for example, pollution, right? They've turned what has no value to society, carbon dioxide, into something that can be traded on a multi-billion-dollar scale, rather than do something actually about it. And this is where also the problem with, some people make comparisons with how other treaties have worked, like for the ozone layer problem, which actually is kind of on its way to being solved, right? There was a treaty, it did come about. What's the difference between what they did with the ozone layer and CFCs and emissions trading? Well, one of the big difference is in all of the international treaties that are talked about, there is no mention of fossil fuels at all in any of the 20 years, in any of those documents. And there is no mention of anything about changing production, which is exactly what happened with the CFCs and the ozone. What they did was say ozone production has to be phased out over a set number of years. So if we actually wanted to tackle CO2 production, emissions and so on, what we would be doing is talking about the elimination of the production of it, as opposed to just talking about emissions once it's already in the atmosphere. And so that would be part of the obvious answer in terms of solutions. Of course, whatever we have been doing has been worse than useless, because this is from the 5th assessment report, and you could see between 2000 and 2010, the different colors are different gases. But if you can look between 2000 and 2010, the last decade, it's accelerated over the previous 3 decades. So actually we've emitted more gas in the decade that we're supposed to be doing something about it than the previous 3 decades. In other words, things are not only just getting worse, they're getting worse at a faster rate. So I was recently in Vietnam, and 10% growth rate a year means that in a couple of decades or so, the size of the economy will be doubled. And so for many developing countries, this is seen as the way out, just like Bolivia. And yet, what does it actually mean? Both in terms, not primarily in terms of CO2 production, because they have the right to develop, but what does it mean for the people within those countries with this development paradigm? And it's not like the people in charge don't know what's going on either. So they've actually mapped out for the next 40 years how bad it's going to be, the OECD. And so these are the world damages to 2035 by inaction on climate change, world damages to 2060, primarily in agriculture, declining. But what are they really concerned about? The only thing that they're concerned about, why is this a problem for the OECD, the World Bank, etc.? The reason it's a problem is because it curtails growth. That's the only reason that this is a problem. not for anything else. And in fact, they summarize their findings in this paper that came out last year. Oh, you can't read the top part. International agreement and cooperation is essential. They say that. This is becoming more difficult. Why? Because emerging economies grow and challenge more established economies, leading to a multipolar world. Increased competition, divergent economic and political interests. What are their solutions? Growth is essential. Any restrictions to growth need to be dealt with. More trade liberalization, etc., deregulation. Where attempts to decreasing inequality clash with growth imperatives, growth should be prioritized. They're so frantic to get the oil out. I don't know whether people have seen this satellite photo before or not, but the Bakken Shale over there, hardly anybody lives there, right? North Dakota. What are those, without being rude or anything, but relatively speaking, you can see the Bakken Shale activity is brighter than Minneapolis-St. Paul, a major city, even though people don't live there. What's that from? Flaring, right? So they're flaring all of the natural gas. So the shale oil comes with natural gas. They're usually found together. Why are they just setting fire to the shale? Because it's so profitable to get the oil out that they can't be bothered to build the pipelines for the gas. So they just set fire to it. So the stuff that they're trying to frack for in the east, right, which we just banned in New York State after a 6-year fight, longer than that really, but the stuff that they want to frack for in the east, natural gas, they're setting fire to in the west because it's cheaper and more profitable to do that than be bothered to get the pipelines working. And that's a quote from the regulator saying, well, we'd like to do something, but we don't want to slow things down. The government regulator. So that, and you can look at a similar photo for the Eagle Ford in Texas field too. And so some of the extractivism that has been located in faraway places, generally speaking, is now spreading all over the globe. But it illustrates the short-term, totally unplanned nature of capital, and also the ways in which, on a more positive note, if you think about, well, we've got not much acreage left over for farming, actually they allocate as much land for oil and gas production as they do for farming. And so if we could easily rearrange that equation. And to the extent that this is becoming a phenomenon, partly as a result of, people talk about action. Well, we obviously saw a lot of action in 2011 in the Middle East, North Africa, but also in North America and around the world, the rise of Occupy. Nobody would be talking in these terms without those movements. I think it's important, as depressed as we can get sometimes, to recognize that there has been a shift in global mass consciousness. And it's very evident in the United States, particularly in the Black Lives Matter movement, which has been the most inspiring demonstrations I've been on in I don't know how long. And it also brings up the question of when have social movements been most successful in the United States? Historically, and most importantly, obviously the Civil War. And if you read David Roediger's book, most recent book, Seizing Freedom, which is fantastic, illustrates just how connected not just ex-black slaves were, but freed black slaves with the white poor workers in the South, and generates the first movement, well, not the first movement, but one of the first movements for women's suffrage. And these people at the time saw all of those things as interconnected. There was also, for the first time, a disability rights movement. It wasn't called that, but so many people, black and white, had been maimed during the Civil War that people saw a whole new conception of what it meant and thought that there should be social provision for all of those people who'd fought for freedom. And so that only ended forcibly with the imposition of the fall of radical Reconstruction and the imposition of the new Jim Crow. Of course, if people were already inherently racist and it hadn't stirred up anti-racist feeling, you wouldn't need all the laws to keep people apart in the first place. And so I don't often quote the Pope, but he has been saying a number of things about how evil capitalism is. Not just him, but also the Dalai Lama. I am farther to the left than the Chinese leaders. They are the capitalists. As people may have seen, ActionAid, Greenpeace, Oxfam just released a statement blaming the 1%, so basically taking the language of Occupy, and stating that actually we can't rely on technology, we can't rely on markets. Both of those things have been the answers so far, right? We have to actually stop tinkering at the edges and talk about structural change. The top 1%, $6.2 trillion in wealth in 1 year. What could we do with $6.2 trillion in wealth? Or it doesn't even make any healthcare sense, actually. So National Academy of Sciences, 2010, what are the damages created by the coal industry? 62 billion. What would it take to pay off every single miner in the United States and give them a full pension of 50 grand a year, tax-free? A tenth of that. So we could shut down the entire coal industry, give a very good income to every single coal miner, and still have 90% of the money left over that we would save from healthcare and so on and so forth. So when people say that we are constrained by things, what we're constrained by is capital. Not anything to do with how much money we've got or resources or like the inability to save some species or other species. And I think that because we're forced into this mindset that everything is scarce all the time, and it is for us, right, in terms of we're all competing all the time for housing, education, a job, against each other, because there's never enough somehow or another. Actually, there's vast oceans of capital and wealth that are being squandered, human as well as natural, right? What could we do when you think of all the amazing things that we've done in the world, and the lander just landing on a comet 400,000 miles away from the Earth, a lander this size on it. When we've done all those things with a fraction of the human potential, what would happen if we had 7 billion minds free to think about solving problems? That would be an amazing world to live in. On the one hand, we need to be fighting for things that people are already fighting for in terms of important reforms. So winning time for ourselves to prevent some of the bad things that are being talked about happening. So in many ways, that doesn't even matter what we're fighting against, as long as we're actually fighting. So when you were saying, well, we've got to get up and do things, first of all, lots of people have been doing that for lots and lots of years. We just don't necessarily hear about it all the time. We obviously need to generalize, because what's at the root of this is the growth imperative of capital. Capital can't exist without growth, and as Naomi Klein has said, that is a logical inconsistency on a finite planet. And yet there is no end to that, right? Everything, they know everything as well as we do. They're the ones who produce the reports. And yet it doesn't affect at all the trajectory of capital. They are locked in both in terms of material terms and ideologically. So we need to win some battles to build up our sense of organization, because I think that's what we've been really lacking for the last 30 odd years, is not just a lack of organization, but a lack of any sense that we can demand more, right? And I think we have to go back to something that was talked about in the French Revolution and other revolutions too, but the idea of revolutionary time. That things kind of in an Einsteinian sense, as opposed to a Newtonian mechanical sense, time can speed up and does speed up during revolutionary periods. So that what formerly you'd think took 50 years or 100 years to take place actually takes place in a few years. And so the emancipation of slaves or any number of other significant revolutionary impacts occur over very, very short periods of time. So the question is, how do we get to a period when we're looking at that kind of thing, which is the kind of crunch question, if we're prepared to accept that this is not the best of all possible worlds. All right? Can we put on the table that we should be looking at a totally different society, one run along completely different lines, in terms of, instead of competition, private property, production for profit, we're looking at cooperation and production for need based on real democracy, right? What would that kind of world look like? How would we reorganize all of our cities to reintegrate ourselves with food, with each other, and begin to see ourselves not as a set of relationships between things, but as a set of relationships between each other, other species, and the planet that we ultimately all depend on. And I guess just to finish with a quote from Marx, who is, you know, the arch materialist or whatever, in a very non-materialist kind of way. Private property has made us so stupid and one-sided that an object is only ours when we have it, when it exists for us as capital, or when it is directly possessed, eaten, drunk, worn, inhabited, etc. In short, when it's used by us. He talks about the ways in which actually all of our senses are degraded just by the concept of owning something. In other words, it's yours or it's mine, as opposed to it's ours. And that in itself degrades us from our own species, so that not only the five senses, but also the so-called mental senses, what he calls the practical senses of will, love, etc. He labels as a practical sense. In a word, human sense. The human nature of the senses comes to be by virtue of its object. The forming of the five senses is a labor of the entire history of the world down to the present. So I think that is an important way in which Marx talks about all that we know is actually come through all of the prior generations. You know, capitalist science has been very good at solving problems directed towards capital. In other words, a very reductionist mindset. It's been very poor and avoided the kind of problems that it's not very good at, which is the more holistic understanding of the interconnections between things. And so it's that kind of process approach regarding the interactions as the important things that I think we would also want to see reborn in a different society to help us understand and rearrange and overcome all of the very significant problems that we have. Because even in these dark days, I think there's a lot of scope for revolutionary change.
If you can change your vote when you change your mind, that is what democracy is all about. Now polling.ca.
Perpetual democracy doesn't mean that you have to vote every day. It just means that you have the right and the ability to vote anytime you want. And that is what perpetual democracy is all about.